Hi all. So today I, Dr. S.J. Kala, an Associate Professor of English at Fatima College, Madurai, would like to deal on Susan Sontag's Against Interpretation. So she begins her essay by talking to us about the experience of art. She says that the earliest experience of art must have been in the form of incantatory, that's to say, kind of recitation of a sloga or something, or magical, because in those days we should understand that art was an instrument of ritual. And then she moves on to say how people would have experienced art, or what was art really to them. From incantatory or magical recitations, they might have moved on to certain paintings, especially the paintings that we come across in the caves at certain exploration sites in all of these places, okay, and others too, in India, in Ajanta and Ellora caves. And with regard to the experience of art, Susan Sontag goes further to talk about what the Greek philosophers must have meant. So, according to the Greek philosophers, the earliest theory of art, that art was mimesis, that is to say, the imitation of reality. And so, when we talk about Greek philosophers, we begin with Plato. It was Plato who proposed the theory, and he did that to rule out the fact that the value of art is not very significant, it is dubious. He considered ordinary material things as mimetic objects. So now, in continuation with Plato's views on art, he said that any object in reality was an imitation. So when he said imitation, what did he mean by that? It was imitation of transcendental forms, structures, or the best painting. Take, for example, even the best painting. You will not see it as you will see it only as a copy of the reality. That is to say, an imitation of an imitation. Okay? So for Plato, he felt that art was not particularly useful. Why? Take for example the painting of a bed. Will it be useful in any ways? Can you lie down on that painting of a bed? You cannot. And so, for Plato, art was not particularly useful. Okay? So now, when Plato says this about art, you have Aristotle, who, in his arguments in defense of art, does not really challenge Plato's view, but he says that all art is an elaborate trompe-l'oeil. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing the French phrase, which means to say they deceive the eye, or rather they are deceptions of the eye. They are not what you see, and therefore they are a lie. So I don't say he challenges what Plato said, but he just says that all art forms are deceptions of eye. And he disputes Plato's idea that art is useless. And in what sense, or how does he do that? According to Aristotle, art has a certain value. Okay, Plato said art is useless. But according to Aristotle, art has a certain value. Whether it is a lie or no lie, it's a form of therapy. One should understand that. So any art, even these days we say that art has therapeutic value, okay, values. And so Aristotle also was of that view. Aristotle counters that art is medicinally useful. When he says that art is a form of therapy, he basically means that it is medicinally useful. How? Art helps in arousing and purging dangerous emotions. Okay, the Greek scholars have always talked about the cathartic effect of art. Okay, and so here art has that purpose of purging emotions, especially the dangerous emotions. So now let's focus on the mimetic theory of art. It goes hand in hand with whatever Plato and Aristotle said. How does it go hand in hand with that? With the assumption that art is always figurative. However, both of them, or even the mimetic theory of art, advocates that, or when they say we should understand that those who propagate that, or the advocates of mimetic theory, need not close their eyes to decorative and abstract theory. Now please understand, here is the modal used, need not. It is so, we can understand that even the advocates of mimetic theory, when they talked about art being an imitation, they were also very conscious of how art, the decorative and the abstract concept with regard to art. So now, there's always a fallacy that art is necessarily a realism. So we think that art has to be very realistic, only then it will be so appealing and so on. But please understand that the fallacy that art is necessarily a realism can be modified and it can be totally scrapped out. How? Without even moving outside the problems delimited by the mimetic theory. See, the mimetic theory has certain boundaries. So you need not even cross those boundaries to modify or scrap out the fallacy that art is necessarily a realism. So now we move on to the Western consciousness of art and reflection upon art. They say that it has always remained within the confines of Greek theory. So even the Westerners believed in the Greek theory of art as mimesis or representation. Actually, it is Greek theory of art. Okay. Now, according to this mimetic theory of art, this theory is a little problematic, and so we need to go. There is a need of defense. It is the defense. So when you go in defending art, or when you begin to defend art, it is at that time that it gives birth to an odd vision, which we have all started calling as form. You understand? I repeat. So this theory, this mimetic theory of art is a little problematic, and you find that you need to go in defense of it. So you have to defend it. And so when you go in defense of this art, it is at this time that you understand that there is an odd vision. And this vision, we have started learning to call it as form. Now this form, when you get to know about a form, when you separate form from what we started learning to call content. Now so there's form, there's something called form. You started gradually understanding about form, and especially when you went in defense of the art, you found that there's a structure, and later on gradually you understand that there's also something called content, and this content becomes essential and form becomes an accessory. So even in modern times, most of the artists and critics have discarded the theory of art, and on the basis that art is just a representation of an outer reality, especially in favor of the theory of art when you have a subjective experience. So the main feature of the mimetic theory still persists there. So people have started throwing away the theory of art as the representation of an outer reality, and the subjective experience is always associated with it. So whether the work of art is conceived, take for example on the model of a picture or on the model of a statement. So when you take it as on the model of a picture, you tend to consider art as a picture of reality, right? If you focus on the model of statement, then you begin to say or begin to understand art as a statement of artist. So in both cases, what is it that happens? It's not the form, but it's the content that comes first. Now, according to the mimetic theory of art, which we are still continuing, we understand that the content may have changed with the passage of time, and presently they may now be less figurative, less lucidly realistic. Still, it is assumed that a work of art is nothing but its content. So here It's not the form that's given importance, it's the content that is given important. So what do we mean by that? What do we mean by a work of art? What's the definition? So let's look into the definition. When you look at the definition, so by definition we say that a work of art is what X is saying is, says, take for example a painting. When you look at the painting, when would you call that painting a work of art? When you start commenting on it, saying what X is saying is, or what X is trying to say is, or what X said is, and so on and so forth. So the moment you start interpreting the piece of art, it becomes a work of art. Okay? Now we move on to Susan Sontag's part, the second part of Against Interpretation. She begins by justifying art here. She says, presently it is difficult to retrieve the innocence before all theory. Now imagine those days when they just started drawing a tree or on a cave, on the walls of a cave, or a deer on the walls of a cave. Do you think that there might have been some interpretations associated with it? Nothing. They might have just enjoyed or relished the very act of drawing. So as Aristotle says, they might have had a therapeutic effect on them. And so you understand that there was some innocence associated with it. There were no interpretations then, and therefore art was in its pristine form, without anything, I won't say adulteration, without anything else that were to embellish them. Okay? So a time when when I said we cannot retrieve the innocence that were there earlier, what do I mean by that? Let us go to that time when art did not have, and to justify itself, nobody had to defend art or didn't say, oh, I'm so good, I'm useful, I have therapeutic values, and nothing like that. So it didn't have it didn't have to take efforts to justify itself. Likewise, there was no one bothered about what the work of art said, because everybody knew, okay, this is what is it, a drawing of a tree there. Everybody knew, okay, it's a tree. Everybody knew it, or everybody thought what it conveyed. Okay? But now, in the present days, we are all stuck with the task of major task, key task, prime task of defending art. So we have started going on to defend art, and therefore in the process of defending art, what are we engaging in? We are obliged to overthrow any means of defending and justifying art which becomes obtuse or onerous or insensitive to contemporary needs and practice. Obtuse or onerous, sometimes we tend to be slow with it, or we just push them aside saying they are unwanted in this present contemporary needs and practice. Right? Presently, so if that is the case, what is it to do with the idea of content? Presently, the very idea of content itself, in the past, so we are comparing it with what it meant in the past. In the past, the idea of content may be anything, but today it's mainly a hindrance, a nuisance, a subtle or not so subtle Philistinism. Okay, so it is all to do with Philistinism. Now, at one point of time, we find that art is kind of distracting us or leading us away from the primary work of art and that is its content. So we find that we are misled. We are digressing from the core element of art, that is content, and the idea is still a little extraordinarily hegemony. There is some kind of an hegemony there, and this is because the idea is now perpetuated in the guise of a certain way of encountering works of art. So how do we deal with them? How are we approaching them? This is what bothers us most, and when we do that, we are moving away from the content, and this is particularly found in those people in whom or who ingrain or who take art seriously, it is ingrained, this kind of an idea is ingrained among people who take art seriously. So now we continue with the idea of content, and we find that there's an overemphasis on the idea of content, which leads on to a perennial, never consummated project of interpretation. So you understand, our focus is not on form, our focus is all the time on the content, and so we are eternally and perennially involved in interpretation. And therefore, we have started not appreciating art, but started approaching the works of art, and we have started making it a habit. Now, when we make this a habitual action, what do? We start to interpret them, and when we interpret them, it sustains the fancy that there is the content of a work of art, it is the content of the work of art that precedes everything else. Okay? So now we move on to the third part of Susan Sontag's Against Interpretation, wherein she does not refer to interpretation as there are no facts, only interpretations, as has been pointed out by Nietzsche. Okay? For her, interpretation is a conscious act of the mind which illustrates a certain code. And so when I say there are certain code, it means there are certain rules of interpretation. Okay? She's of the view that interpretation with regard to art means taking away or plucking away a set of elements. Say the set of elements may be X, Y, Z or something. So you have the whole work. From that you cull out certain elements, say for example the X, the Y or the Z, and then you start interpreting. So the task of interpretation is nothing but one of translation. So it's virtually one of translation. So from interpretation, she slightly moves on to the interpreter, and she says that when the interpreter normally says, when the interpreter is interpreting a whole text or a whole piece of art or work of art, as I told you in the previous slide, they try to cull out few elements or a set of elements, and when they do that, the interpreter tries to say that X is really, or that really means A, or Y is really B, or Z is really C, and don't you see all of these things in the text? So this is what they're trying to interpret. So they're trying to give some meaning or some additional interpretations to what are already there. So now, in what situation do we engage in interpretation? When we do that, this curious project becomes a means of transforming a text. Okay, so this is a curious project of interpretation, wherein you take materials from history to transform a text, and that history gives the materials for an answer. Now, interpretations appears in the culture. When did interpretation really appear? In the culture of late classical antiquity. So very soon interpretation also started joining hands with a work of art. But there were times, as we just thought about it a little earlier, there were times when work of arts were innocent in all their ways. So you find that interpretation appeared in the culture of late classical antiquity, especially when the power and the credibility of myth was broken by what? See, they were all, in the classical era, they were all too engrossed in the mythology. But there came a moment when the realistic view of the world came, and the whole thing about the power and credibility of myth was broken. It is at that time that interpretation crept in. Next, by interpretation appearing into this era, along with it, it was also introduced by scientific enlightenment. When people started focusing on scientific issues, interpretation also tugged along with a work of art. Now, there's always a question that haunts the post-mystic consciousness. What is it? Religion is always untouched, okay? And that's a very sensitive issue also. So there is a kind of seemliness of religious symbols asked. and the ancient text no longer accepted. See, the ancient text is no longer acceptable in their pristine form. You cannot take them as they are or as they say. You tend to question them a lot, especially even if they have religious symbols in them. So interpretation was then summoned to reconcile the ancient text to modern demands. So whenever there were ancient texts, when you started reading the ancient texts in the present days, you felt that there are something that are not okay with us. So you started questioning. And when you started questioning them, interpretation was summoned. So that was how the modern demands were met. Thus, the Stoics were of the view that the gods had to be moral. Okay, the Stoics. So they allegorized away his boisterous clan in Homer's epics. In Homer's epics, you find that it's presented, the life of gods are presented in the form of an allegory. And Homer's documentation between the adultery between Zeus and Leto, okay, it's to do with the gods, and that's quite a touchy issue. That's quite sensitive. That's quite a sensitive issue. And therefore, the Stoics explain this adultery between Zeus and Leto, because gods have to be role models, and what will people do if they are if gods themselves engage in adultery? So the Stoics started explaining that as the union between power and wisdom. Okay, so likewise, the Philo of Alexandria, he interpreted the literal historical narratives of so the Bible also was not spared. So he interpreted the Hebrew Bible as spiritual paradigms. According to Philo, so we all know about how the Jews were led by Moses from the land of Egypt to the promised land of Canaan, where milk and honey flows. And that's the story of Exodus from Egypt. And they wandered in the desert for 40 years before they enter the promised land. Okay. Now this is an Exodus that's documented in the Bible, in the book of Bible of the Old Testament. But then here, Philo questions that also, and he presents that as an allegory of individual soul. He says that it deals with the Exodus from Egypt to the promised land for 40 years, deals with an individual soul's emancipation, tribulations, and final deliverance. And therefore, interpretation is believed to be a discrepancy between the clear meaning of the text and the demands of readers. I repeat, therefore, interpretation is nothing but there's a kind of a discrepancy between what? Between the clear meaning that the text gives and the demands of the readers. And interpretation strives to resolve that discrepancy. The situation is that for some reason, a text has, for some reason, because of the situation, some texts have become unacceptable. And though they are unacceptable, still you cannot discard them. There is this mode of interpretation which will help us interpret the text in a better way, make it acceptable too. So interpretation is basically a radical strategy, and it will help us conserve an old text. In what form? So in a revamped rather than a repudiated form, right? And here we need to understand that the interpreter alters a text without actually erasing or rewriting the text. Please understand, an interpreter does not delete or does not rewrite the text, but he changes. He makes some changes. But then will he admit it? No, he cannot admit that, and therefore he claims to make it intelligible. So he doesn't say that he is modifying. When we say modifying, he is not rewriting, he is not altering, he is not deleting. But then he will not accept that he is making the changes also. Rather, any interpreter will tell all of us that he is making it intelligible. Making what? Making the text intelligible. How is he making the text intelligible? By disclosing its true meaning. However, for the interpreter alters the text, they claim to reading offers sense. They say they're trying to bring in some sense there, not new sense. Okay. okay, but sense that is already there. Therefore, you have an example here, the notorious, the rabbinic and the Christian. Here, there is a spiritual interpretations of the clearly erotic song of the songs. Presently, in the present days, that's today, we find interpretation to be more complex. Especially in the contemporary era, interpretation is prompted by all of these things. What are they? An open aggressiveness, two things, an open aggressiveness and an overt contempt for appearances. So you are not very much pleased with the appearances. And so because of these two things also, sometimes interpretation comes in. So rather than by the piety towards the troublesome text. So nobody engages in interpretation because they consider a troublesome text something pious or something pious. They approach a text because of its open aggressiveness or because they have a contempt for its appearances. Now, coming on to the style of interpretation. There is an old style of interpretation which is both insistent but respectful. So what happens here? You have a literal meaning. On top of the literal meaning, you start erecting other meanings, and that is the old style of interpretation. On the contrary, you have modern style of interpretation where you excavate, and in the process you destroy the whole text. Okay, you keep digging behind the text. Why? To find a subtext, a true one, and the process you destroy the text. Old style of interpretation, I go back, it is respectful, it is insistent. But then what do? There is a literal meaning. On top of the literal meaning, you tend to build more and more meanings. And in the modern style of interpretation, it is not building up, but it's rather digging up. So you keep digging up more and more with the main aim of going behind the text, and thereby you try to excavate, and in the process you destroy the whole text just to find a subtext saying that will be the true one. So what are the modern doctrines? The most celebrated and influential modern doctrines of Marx and Freud amount to elaborate systems of hermeneutics, especially being aggressive and impious theories of interpretation. So they delve upon these aggressive and impious theories of interpretation. According to Freud, all observable phenomena are manifest content. Okay, according to Freud, all observable phenomena are manifest content, something that gets manifested, that must be probed and pushed aside to find the true meaning, especially to find the latent content beneath. Right? So for Freud, all phenomena are manifest content. So you keep probing and pushing them aside to find the true meaning, especially the latent content. But for Marx, social events are like revolutions and wars. For Freud, take for example the events of individual lives. They are like neurotic symptoms. You will have slips of the tongue and all of these things. And when you come on to text as well as text, they are like a dream or a work of art, and all are treated as occasions for interpretations. See, regarding the events of individual lives, he says individual lives are full of neurotic symptoms, or there are slips of tongues and all that. But when you come on to the text, he says texts are like a dream or a work of art, and all are treated as occasions, all pave way for interpretations. So according to Freud, these events only seem to be intelligible. They have actually no meaning without interpretation. So without interpretation, you cannot understand at all. There is no meaning at all. So to understand means to interpret. And to interpret, you have to restate the phenomenon. Why should you restate the phenomenon? To find an equivalent for it. Okay? So, without interpretation, there is no meaning. If you need to understand, you have to interpret. And when you interpret, you try to restate the phenomenon. And when you restate the phenomenon, you will find something equivalent to it. Okay, now we go on to consider interpretation as a gesture. Interpretation is thus not an absolute value, it's a gesture of mind that is situated in some timeless realm of capabilities. So, interpretation should not be evaluated on the basis of something else, but it should be evaluated, must itself be evaluated. Interpretation must itself be evaluated. How? With a historical view of human consciousness. What is really there in the human consciousness? And based on that, interpretation itself must be evaluated. Now, cultural context. In certain cultural contexts, interpretation is a liberation act. That means to say, of revising, you tend to revise a text, you tend to give another value to it, of transvaluing, or you tend to escape from the dead past. So, interpretation is a liberation art in certain cultures. In other cultural contexts, it is reactionary, modern, particularly impertinent, cowardly, and stifling. Okay, so with that, we come to the end of the third part, and we shall continue with the rest of Susan Sontag's Against Interpretation in the next part of my video. Thank you so much for your patient watching.